The room was too quiet for a place meant to keep people alive. A monitor clicked steadily beside me, cold light spilling across white sheets, and every breath felt borrowed. My chest ached. My hands wouldn't move, and I remember thinking that surviving the accident should have been the hardest part. If you're listening right now and you've ever trusted someone who didn't protect you when it mattered most, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. You're not the only one who's lived through something like this. As I lay there, half awake, half forgotten, a voice drifted through the room from a phone left behind, not panicked, not worried, calm, certain. And in that stillness, I realized no one was searching for me. No one was waiting for me to wake up. My life was already being spoken about in the past tense. That was the moment everything shifted, even though I didn't yet understand what it would take from me, or what it would give me in return. I woke up to the sound of a machine breathing for me, steady and mechanical, filling a room that smelled like antiseptic and plastic. My chest felt tight. My ribs burned when I tried to move, and my face felt unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else. I am 71 years old, and in that moment, I understood how fragile the body becomes when it has been pushed too far. The doctors would later call what happened a miracle, but lying there, barely able to open my eyes, I did not feel lucky. I felt suspended, caught somewhere between before and after, listening to footsteps in the hallway that never stopped for me. Every sound seemed louder than it should have been. Every second stretched thin. I remember thinking that surviving should have been the hardest part, that the fear, the pain, the sudden loss of control would be the thing that stayed with me. But as the minutes passed, another awareness settled in, heavier than the injuries, heavier than the exhaustion. There was something waiting for me beyond the beeping machines and white walls, and even then, before I understood it, I knew it would hurt more than impact. At some point, my body grew still enough that the sounds around me sharpened. I could hear the soft hum of machines, the distant roll of a cart in the hallway, and then a voice that did not belong in that room but carried into it anyway. It wasn't raised or hurried. It was light, almost relieved. And I knew it instantly. The way you know a voice that has lived inside your life for decades. I lay there without moving, listening not to the words themselves, but to the ease behind them. There was no urgency, no fear, no confusion about where I was or whether I might still be alive. What I heard carried an assumption that everything was already settled, that I was no longer a question. I felt it in the pauses, in the way the conversation moved forward without resistance. In that moment, I understood something quietly devastating. No one was asking for updates. No one was pushing back against the idea that I was gone. My absence had been accepted without struggle, maybe even with relief. I realized that if I had truly mattered in that moment, there would have been panic instead of planning. The hurt came slowly, like pressure rather than impact. It wasn't rage or disbelief, it was clarity. The kind that rearranges something deep inside you. I stayed still, not because I couldn't speak, but because something in me had already begun to decide that I wouldn't. For a brief moment after that realization, my instinct was to reach out, to correct the mistake, to let someone know I was still here. My mind moved faster than my body, rehearsing explanations I wasn't strong enough to give, but each time I imagined breaking the silence. Something inside me resisted, not out of fear, but out of awareness. My body was weak, my voice barely worked, every breath felt measured and borrowed. And yet, that physical fragility forced a kind of honesty I had never allowed myself before. I could not rush, I could not perform, I could only sit with what I had learned. And in that stillness, silence stopped feeling like something imposed on me. It became something I chose. For the first time, I saw how much energy I had spent over the years explaining myself, smoothing things over, staying present even when my presence was taken for granted. Now, without a name attached to my bed or a role to fill, I was invisible. And invisibility, I realized, could be protective. No expectations, no demands, just time. Being presumed gone erased more than my identity. It erased the noise. It gave me space to observe instead of react, to understand instead of defend. I didn't need to announce myself yet. I needed to listen, to watch, to let the truth reveal itself without interference, so I stayed quiet. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was finally learning the value of waiting while the world continued on without me. A few days later, when my hands were steady enough to hold a tablet, I searched my own name. I expected confusion, maybe unanswered questions. Instead, I found certainty. There was a notice posted online, brief and polished, marking my life as something already concluded, not a pause, not a waiting period, an ending. What followed felt even heavier. Plans had been made, arrangements finalized. There was no language of uncertainty, no mention of ongoing searches or unanswered calls. My absence had been processed quickly, efficiently, like an item checked off a list. I scrolled slowly, absorbing how easily my existence had been summarized and filed away. Then came the practical decisions. My home was listed as available, described in neutral, appealing terms that erased the years I had spent inside it. Rooms were photographed without sentiment. Objects were categorized, sorted, prepared to be sold or given away. Nothing lingered, nothing hesitated. It wasn't grief I was witnessing. It was replacement. What struck me most was not what was done, but how fast it happened. There was no waiting to see if a mistake had been made, no delay to allow for doubt. My absence wasn't questioned. It was used to move forward, to clear space, to reshape narratives while no one expected me to return. That was when the disbelief hardened into something colder and clearer. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't shock. It was opportunity. My disappearance had created room, and someone had stepped into it without looking back. As I sat there, unseen and officially gone, I realized that while they were busy rearranging my life, they hadn't noticed something else shifting quietly into my hands. It happened without drama, without raised voices or urgent meetings. Power entered my life the way truth often does, quietly and without asking permission. One afternoon, a representative from the airline came to my room, not to ask how I felt, but to explain procedures, timelines, and resolutions. I listened more than I spoke, and the more I listened, the clearer it became that systems move forward whether emotions are involved or not. They had already assumed no one would challenge them, no family demanding answers, no one pressing for details. That assumption worked in my favor. While others had been busy rewriting my story, the structure around it had left me room to stand where no one was looking. I realized then that authority does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply waits for someone patient enough to notice. I had spent years believing power was loud, that it belonged to the person who argued hardest or controlled the narrative. But here, in a quiet room filled with paperwork and polite indifference, I saw something different. Real leverage came from understanding processes, from staying still long enough to see where decisions were actually made. What surprised me most was how invisible I remained. Being underestimated was not a loss. It was an advantage. My silence had created space. My absence had lowered defenses. No one was watching closely enough to realize I was paying attention. As that understanding settled in, something shifted. I stopped reacting to what had been taken from me and began considering what I could now choose. And for the first time, the future felt like something I could shape on my own terms. Leaving the hospital didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a quiet crossing. I stepped into the outside air slower than I used to, my body still learning its limits, but my mind unusually clear. I didn't return to the life that had already been rearranged without me. I chose a different direction, one that required fewer explanations. I gave myself a new name, simple and unremarkable, something that carried no history anyone else could claim. Saying it out loud felt strange at first, but also clean. I moved to a small town where mornings were marked by bakery smells and familiar faces didn't ask where you came from. I rented a modest place, learned the rhythm of the streets, and let my days become smaller in a way that felt expansive. My old life had been loud with expectations. I had been a role before I was a person, a responsibility before I was a choice. Here, No one needed anything from me. I decided when to wake, where to walk, what mattered enough to hold my attention. Evenings were quiet, not lonely. Quiet in the way that lets you hear your own thoughts without interruption. Reinvention wasn't about disappearing. It was about ownership. I wasn't hiding from the past. I was stepping into a present that belonged to me alone. Each small decision added up to something steadier than excitement. It felt like peace, earned rather than borrowed. As I settled into this new life, I noticed something unexpected. When you stop living on someone else's terms, you make room, and sometimes, in that space, something meaningful finds you without trying. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I was sitting in a small cafe near the bookstore, watching people come and go. When I noticed her, there was nothing dramatic about it, just a familiar posture, the way she leaned toward a shelf as if the world slowed down when she read. The recognition came gently, without urgency, and it surprised me with its warmth. I didn't approach her right away. I let the moment be what it was, safe, unforced. What struck me most was how different this felt from the connections I had known before. There was no expectation attached to it, no role I needed to fill. Just a quiet awareness that someone saw the world in a way I understood. When our paths crossed later, the acknowledgement was simple, a look that held certainty instead of questions. It reminded me that care doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows up with patience, with respect for distance, with an ease that doesn't demand anything in return. That was when I realized how much I had changed. I wasn't reaching for reassurance or approval. I could recognize connection without clinging to it. I could let trust build slowly, without surrendering myself in the process. This unexpected presence didn't pull me backward. It grounded me where I was. And as I walked home that evening, I felt steadier than I had in a long time, aware that this quiet bond was preparing me to face a truth I had not yet fully uncovered. And the moment it became clear wasn't dramatic. It came quietly, almost accidentally, through details that didn't line up the way they should have. I was sitting in a corner booth at a restaurant near the financial district, half hidden, when I noticed familiar patterns, not words, but behaviors, timing, confidence, the absence of hesitation. I watched how plans were discussed as if outcomes were already decided. There was no grief shaping those decisions, no uncertainty slowing them down. Everything moved with intention. That was when I began to understand that what I had experienced earlier wasn't a reaction to my disappearance. It was a continuation of something already in motion. Pieces I had ignored for years started fitting together. Small dismissals, conversations redirected, the way my concerns had been framed as obstacles instead of realities. This wasn't about loss. It was about control. My absence hadn't created the plan. It had simply removed the last barrier. What unsettled me most was realizing how long this certainty had existed without my awareness. The betrayal didn't begin with the accident. It had been waiting for an opening. My presumed death had simply accelerated what was already prepared. Any remaining hope I hadn't acknowledged dissolved in that moment, not with anger, but with precision. I felt something detach inside me, like a final thread being cut cleanly instead of torn. There was no confusion left to resolve, no explanation that would change what I now saw clearly. That clarity was sobering, but it was also stabilizing. When you stop expecting honesty from someone who has chosen strategy, you stop negotiating emotionally, you move differently, you plan differently. As I left that space, one thought settled with certainty. This wasn't something to confront with words or feelings. It required structure, and I was finally ready to build it. Once the truth settled, I didn't hesitate anymore. Certainty has a way of removing noise, and what remained was direction. I chose action, not confrontation, because order lasts longer than emotion. The first steps were quiet and deliberate, taken with people who valued clarity over drama. I reorganized what could be accessed, by whom, and under what conditions, without announcing it. My focus was protection, especially for the generation that still deserved stability instead of manipulation. I created boundaries that did not invite debate or explanation. Access became intentional, measured, and earned rather than assumed. There was relief in putting structure where chaos had been allowed to linger. Each decision felt less like loss and more like alignment with my values. I wasn't interested in punishment or exposure. I was interested in removing leverage from hands that had proven they would misuse it. As order returned, my body relaxed in ways I hadn't noticed were tense. Sleep came easier, thoughts steadier, because the future had been secured quietly. I understood then that peace is often built through preparation, not forgiveness. With everything in place, I knew there was one final step left, not to argue, but to be present and unmistakably real. I didn't need acknowledgement or remorse to move forward. I needed closure that came from standing calmly in my truth. The structure was set, the boundaries clear, and the path no longer reactive. What remained was a conversation I could finally enter without fear or urgency. And this time, I would arrive steady, prepared, and fully myself. I walked into that office without hesitation, not because I felt brave, but because I felt finished. The room looked exactly as I remembered it, orderly and composed, built to project control. What changed was not the space, it was me. I stood there long enough to be seen, long enough for recognition to land, and I watched the shift happen before any words could have. I didn't need to raise my voice or list grievances. The truth had already settled in me, and that made it steady. I could see the calculation give way to uncertainty, the confidence thinning as reality caught up. I wasn't there to argue timelines or intentions. I was there to mark the end of my silence with presence. What mattered most in that moment was not what I said, but what I no longer needed. I didn't need an apology to validate what I knew. I didn't need acknowledgement to confirm my worth. Standing there, fully intact and unmoved, I felt the balance shift. Not in my favor over someone else's, but back into myself. I let the truth exist without defending it. I let the space hold what it needed to hold. Then I turned away. There was no confrontation left to prolong, no outcome to negotiate. Leaving felt lighter than arriving, not because something had been won, but because something had been released. As I stepped back into the hallway, I understood that dignity doesn't come from being believed or forgiven. It comes from recognizing yourself clearly and choosing when to walk away. And with that, I was ready for what came next. After that day, nothing dramatic followed. No messages, no attempts to reopen what had already closed. What arrived instead was quiet, the kind that settles gently rather than echoing. I noticed it in the mornings, when I woke without the familiar tension in my chest, and in the evenings, when I sat with a book and realized I wasn't waiting for anything to happen. My days became simple in a way that felt grounding. I walked the same routes, greeted the same neighbors, brewed coffee slowly instead of rushing through it. There was comfort in repetition, in knowing what the day would hold and trusting that it belonged to me. I didn't replay conversations anymore. I didn't brace myself for conflict that never came. What surprised me most was the absence of any desire to retaliate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Free from needing to be understood by someone who had already chosen not to see me. Free from proving anything. The peace I felt wasn't loud or celebratory. It was steady, earned through restraint and clarity, healing. I learned. Doesn't announce itself. It shows up when fear stops directing your choices, when your life feels self-directed instead of reactive. I wasn't measuring my progress against anyone else's anymore. I was simply living, safely inside my own boundaries. That was when I understood something worth sharing. Resolution isn't about who wins or loses. It's about who gets to move forward unburdened. And that realization stayed with me, quietly asking to be passed on. Looking back now, I don't measure this journey by what I lost or even by what I protected. I measure it by what I learned about myself. I learned that silence can be strength, that boundaries are not punishments, and that choosing yourself is not an act of selfishness, but of survival. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, overlooked by people who should have cared, I want you to know this story isn't just mine. It's about what happens when you stop asking for permission to exist fully. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It's a series of small, honest choices made every day, often quietly, often without witnesses. I'm grateful you spent this time with me, listening, holding space for a story that wasn't easy to tell. Your presence matters more than you might realize. If any part of this resonated with you, I invite you to share your experience in the comments. I read every one, and you're not alone here. If you found value in this story, consider liking the video or subscribing so these conversations can continue. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that dignity, peace, and self-respect are possible, even after betrayal. Thank you for being here. Wherever you are on your own journey, I hope you leave feeling seen, steady, and a little less alone.